Thank you very much. I feel like this paper has been going through various incarnations, so I'll tell you whenever things shift. One of the things to add, especially in reflection, a little bit of wine and a little bit of sleep on Russell's comments, is the idea of beyond the boundary that I want to bring in that's not in the original account. So, to begin, introduction. The seeds of this paper are a certain disgust with the present uncivil cycle. Yes?
Some people might have the first draft. I made a mistake in sending them, so it's not exactly the same. Everything is moving.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So once again, it's in my discontent really with the uncivil cycle and the quality of political rhetoric in the United States that we're presently in, both in general as well as it applies to various different issues, among which are these: gay marriage and religion, general access to health care and specific access to health care for women, immigration, human dignity, and the resultant encounters between cultures, racial identity and race relations, the global ecosystem, global warming, anthropocentrism, and the demeaning of non-human life, politics, religion, and conflict in its many guises around the world, and the rise of the political right in my country in the mid-1990s, the emergence of the Tea Party movement in response to big government and the election of our president, and the tiresome caterwauling of 17 Republican presidential candidates. This presentation is my first step in a larger project that I envision that builds upon Tillich's notion of the boundary. That project has as its goal a humbler, more inclusive, and more unifying approach to political discourse than seems to dominate the present. Here I will first offer some ideas on potential roots for such an idea in Tillich's concept of the boundary. Second, I will suggest as an adjustment a situation which Tillich brushes up against in one of his last bits of writing on the meaning of the boundary, a situation beyond the boundary, that I will argue to be less dangerous and more meaningful for living than on the boundary, a situation rooted in the gracious and empowering presence of the infinite to which his thought gives voice. And third, I will point to two projects for nurturing such a reality: on the cultivation of mindfulness arising out of the Christian-Buddhist dialogue, and approaches to discussion as a non-contentious instrument in teaching. So number one, boundary and experience. Issues of global significance require sound, open, dignified discourse, civil discourse. Tillich's notions of the boundary and the method of correlation seem to be obvious places to consider in establishing a starting point. In the experience of traumatic change, the boundary becomes a vivid metaphor for self-definition. Considering the path Tillich's life took, a path shared by many others in his generation, considering this leads to an understanding of why this would be so. The birth into empire, the death of that empire in war, the nation's two experiments in reassembling a new path, the first creative, the second destructive, the forced emigration from one's motherland, the reestablishment of some semblance of stability in a new place, the onset of a Second World War with the inescapable intercultural dynamics one experiences internally and externally, the fleeting hope for a new path of internationalism, perhaps realistic, definitely hopeful, the dashing of such hopes in the operation of superpowers in a new bipolar world, and the turn to a deep period of recollection and processing, taking account and visioning. If one has not experienced such trauma, such experiences of crises, the threatening dimension of the boundary concept remains an enigma. Consider places where the boundary remains militarized today. To a degree, certainly the southern border of the United States with Mexico, but more the lines of demarcation between Palestinian and Israeli territories, and the very so-called demilitarized zone separating the two Koreas, the island of Cyprus, Kuwait and Iraq, and Serbia and Kosovo. Then consider immigration, particularly as an echo of the experience of the immigrant Paul Tillich. Europe has experienced its latest wave of significant immigration. Everything from the security of the Calais entry point to the Channel, to the new land routes from the Middle East and North Africa to Europe. On the North American continent, the southern border of the United States remains the stuff of political clamor, the most absurd being Donald Trump's characterization of Mexican immigrants and his perplexing expectation that Mexico be expected to build a wall to prevent immigration. The basic hostility toward immigration here, that is, I'm saying in the United States, seems to be rooted in the fear of the growth of immigrant populations, fear of change, racism, discomfort, denial of the connection, often an exploitive one, between North America and Central and South Americas, and the desire to maintain, again, particularly in the U.S., a monolingual paradise. So you have absolutely no reason to say to me this babbling in the introduction. That's my own stupidity and ignorance. 2, boundary, power, and finitude. It is important to consider the realism of Tillich by seriously reflecting on his notions of power, human finitude, and boundary. The boundary is a multi-layered metaphor for Tillich. Theologically, it's the place, and I put that in quotes, where beings experience the threatening no and the affirming yes of the ground of being or being itself, our primal and fundamental experience of finitude and grace. Intellectually, it's the place of our infinitude, where the inner world of human beings can experience the processing, the considering of, the weighing of, the reflection upon conceptual possibilities without end. Spatially and conceptually, it is a realm of perpetual crossing between one place and another. Geographical places, cultural places, conceptual places. One sees places where Tillich's interpretation of art implies the two sides of the boundary situation. The yes of the boundary expressed in Botticelli's Madonna and Child with Singing Angels, and the no of the boundary expressed through his interpretation of Picasso's Guernica. Botticelli's message of consolation in the World War I period was followed by Picasso's message of confrontation in the inner world war period. And I turn to the footnote there for a moment just to turn to his autobiography on the boundary, where he wrote that the boundary is the best place for acquiring knowledge, presupposing receptiveness to new possibilities, fruitful for thought. But it's difficult and dangerous in life, which again and again demands decisions and thus exclusiveness to alternatives. It's a boundary that defined his life, he saw. And in 1962, he commented, existence on the frontier in the boundary situation is full of tension and movement. It is in truth no standing still, but a crossing and return, a repetition of returning and crossing. But interestingly, the next part of it says, a back and forth, the aim of which is to create a third area beyond the bounded territories, an area where one can stand for a time without being enclosed in something tightly bound. In 1957, reflecting on cultural provincialism and his experience of living in two different cultures, he wrote of himself as one who has, quote, still at least in some corners of his being, the observer attitude, which I think is quite key here. And I think for observation, it is useful to live on the boundary line between these cultures. For living, it's not good. It splits. But for observation, it's good. Now, this is a distinction that I want to challenge later, that specific one. The boundary perspective led Tillich to take power seriously from early on. During Weimar, much of his political and social and political religious discourse seemed to be working out what he would call in 1927 the perspective of, quote, self-transcending realism, unquote. In the 1931 piece, The Problem of Power, Tillich points to the position of privilege which allows one to choose one's relationship to might and power, identifying Buddhism and Christianity as two religious traditions that teach of one's transcendent capacity for rising to a sense of meaning beyond might and power. So with that, I turn to section 3, boundary, infinitude, and Buddhism. Later in life, Tillich wrote Christianity and the Encounter of the World Religions, for which we have now a new French translation, correct, in the newest volume. There he formulated a structure for dialogue. He addressed what he termed the quasi-religions of nationalism and communism while denying liberal democracy such a status due to the contradiction to its ideology required for it to defend itself. The primary religion he addressed was Buddhism. Interestingly, what he termed one of the greatest, strangest, and at the same time most competitive of the religions proper, end quote. Forgotten that he'd used the word strange there. In comparing Christianity and Buddhism, Tillich considers these matters: the aim or telos of each tradition, Christianity and the kingdom of God, Buddhism and nirvana. The consequent valuation of existence, for both of them, negative. Christianity capturing this in the fall, Buddhism in being bound to the wheel of life, characterized by suffering. Kingdom of God implies participation. Nirvana implies identity. Participation gives rise to agape. Identity gives rise to compassion. Christianity's revolutionary transformation of reality is contrasted with Buddhism's salvation from the cyclicality of reality, with, quote, no transformation of society as a whole, no aspiration for the radically new in history, end quote. The Buddhist doctrine of anatman, that is the belief in no independent substance on the part of individual beings, leads Tillich to assert that Buddhists trade community, which he sees as requiring separation of beings, each possessing an independent substance, trading community for identity, that is the unity of beings sharing a common substance. The result tends towards a distinction between the mystical being pole of Buddhism and the ethical ought-to-be pole of Christianity. Tillich described the polar distinction by constructing a hypothetical conversation. This is in your footnote, but I'll read it here. The Buddhist priest asked the Christian philosopher, do you believe that every person has a substance of his own which gives him true individuality? The Christian answers, certainly. The Buddhist priest asks, do you believe that community between individuals is possible? The Christian responds affirmatively again. Then the Buddhist says, your two answers are incompatible. If every person has a substance, no community is possible. To which the Christian replies, only if each person has a substance of his own is community possible, for community presupposes separation. You, Buddhist friends, have identity, but not community, end quote. Now, where I want to push Tillich is in furthering the late-in-life cause for fruitful rhetoric across the religious boundaries. Here again with Buddhism. This requires a reframing of his mystical, ethical, and being ought-to-be polarities that have been tempting ways to contrast and distort both traditions. With this, the opening of Christianity, Christian culture to mindfulness, a path associated with Buddhism, becomes possible. With Christianity, Tillich was already wrestling with the mystical versus the ethical distinction, warning Protestants not to neglect the former in favor of the latter. Quote, a Protestantism which has no more place for meditation and contemplation, for ecstasy and mystical union, has ceased to be religion and has become an intellectual and moral system in traditional religious terms, end quote. One key to navigating this issue, I think, may relate to finitude and infinitude within human beings. In the 1939 fragment, Religion and World Politics, Tillich connected the human experience of world having with the notion of infinitude. First, to have a world, quote, means to have a self which is simultaneously closed within itself, yet part of a comprehensive unity. Second, the theoretical inexhaustibility of the world is the sharpest expression for the infinitude of world having. Further, 12 years later, Tillich offers thoughts on the relationship of finitude and infinitude within humankind in part 2 of the systematic theology. There he wrote, everything which participates in the power of being is mixed with non-being. And this is where I think Russell's comments related to ambiguity might come into play. It is being in the process of coming from and going toward non-being. It is finite. Now, infinity is related to finitude as a dynamic and free self-transcendence of finite being. Infinity is a directing concept, not a constituting concept. It directs the mind to experience its own unlimited potentialities, but it does not establish the existence of an infinite being. He provides further explanation, and I'll just do the first half of this. Infinitude is finitude transcending itself without any a priori limit. The power of infinite self-transcendence is an expression of humankind's belonging to that which is beyond non-being, namely to being itself. The potential presence of the infinite as unlimited self-transcendence is the negation of the negative element in finitude, non-being. In the last sentence, being itself manifests itself to finite being and the infinite drive of the finite beyond itself. Thus, Tillich's treatment of the finitude and infinitude of humanity and his definition of God as being itself or ground of being leads to the question of the relationship of a person's infinite self as a being to being itself, that is, to God. When connected to his assertion that Christian identity includes the dimension of the meditative and the mystical while maintaining the central importance of the prophetic critique, it seems that his sound understanding of Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism, and its notion of the bodhisattva as the ideal, one who approaches nirvana but who rejects utter liberation from suffering in favor of leading others along the path toward moksha, could have, I should say, led Tillich to affirm greater resonance between Christianity and Buddhism. His reading of Christianity centered around the Christ whose particularity is sacrificed while maintaining universality, as in the Johannine Logos. It seems to have echoes in the sacrifice of the Bodhisattva's personal choice to restrain from embracing nirvana in favor of giving access to the path toward non-suffering to a broader, theoretically universal community. Thus, just as the threat of boundary faced by Christ is overcome by the simultaneous sacrifice of self and preservation of the universal logos, so the bodhisattva embraces a boundary in order to guide others toward the universally accessible condition of nirvana. Now, what I am posing through this type of an exercise, a project, is to suggest that a project to which our time is calling us is this: to seek out approximate points of contact of this kind in order to step back from the precipice of catastrophe which I think threatens to divide humanity and creation as a whole in ever greater regions of the world. And I think of now 2 Mississippi young women arrested today for trying to go over to join ISIS. That sort of thing is the type of thing that's coming to my mind. I seek a reconstruction of the boundary that redefines it as pointing to the most meaningful place to live. This is a life of mindful being, which includes the dynamics of the inner world within it, rather than an understanding of reality as one containing a boundary as a sort of compartment of life, containing transcendence. Rather than that, this is the beyond the boundary reality composed of the totality of one's experience of life, only part of which is formal transcendence. The possibility of transcendence is actually generally available in life, is what I'm saying. And I realize you don't have that in your text, so I wanted to emphasize that. The beyond boundary, that is the container of all and within which we have access to the transcendent at all times, though we can take moments, whether it's in meditation or worship or prayer, to formalize that capacity for transcendence and practice it in a sense. Section 4, discovering the richness of the infinite beyond the boundary. I may have renamed that. Mindfulness and education. Calling for an extension of our understanding of boundaries leads to a range of questions. What might be the nature of the beyond the boundary existence as contrasted with Tillich's conceptual discursive one, for example, the correlational method, philosophy posing the questions, theology providing the answers? Would it be a demilitarized zone between hostile forces, a place of danger and risk, or could beyond the boundary existence become a place of revelatory, holy habitation, a place of daring, a place where finitude is infused with infinitude, a place where estrangement is regularly met by reconciliation, a place where we enable one another to experience salvific, remember with Tillich, healing connection? Is there a need to mine the infinitude of the beyond the boundary existence? In fact, Tillich's approach implied this in some areas. 2 examples were his political speeches and his ongoing dialogue with the psychotherapeutic community. Tillich saw great value in psychology and psychotherapy probing the depth dimension of human being, particularly the unconscious. He wrote extensively on this. His goal in writing weekly speeches for his German audiences over the Voice of America for more than 2 years was this, quote, to ponder with you the inner preparation for the German future. What came into question was always twofold, the separation from National Socialism, the preparation for a new future in Germany. It seems like a call to individual and cultural mindfulness. His examples of this type of beyond the boundary existence should be of vital importance to us. Further, he would have found additional fruitful such paths of dialogue among them. And among them would have been discussion with practitioners of mindfulness and innovators in education. So I wanted to turn in the last section here to mindfulness and education concretely. The topic of mindfulness made the cover of Time magazine in February of last year. The cover title was this, The Mindful Revolution, the Science of Finding Focus in a Stressed-Out, Multitasking Culture. The article describes the impact of the practice upon those facing serious illness, members of Congress, members of the military, employees at Google, and others simply trying to find inner order amidst the fast pace of contemporary life. The ground had certainly been prepared by a range of religious and non-religious figures. A handful of them I am describing here. Charlotte Joko Beck practiced and taught the practice of Zen Buddhism in a way that seemed amenable to the culture of the United States for many years. For her, meditative practice was not escapism, but preparation for full engagement with life. Practice isn't just sitting on a cushion 30 or 40 minutes a day. Our whole life becomes practice 24 hours a day. Human beings are basically good, kind, and compassionate, but it takes hard digging to uncover that buried jewel, end quote. For several decades, Ellen Longer has completed significant scientific research on the impact of living either mindlessly or mindfully. She looks at the psychological impact of cultivating a mind that is agile, enabling it to create new categories in the face of failed ones, to be open to new data that can contradict previously held truths, to understand and accept the reality of multiple perspectives on a single phenomenon, to embrace control over one's context, and to emphasize the priority of process to specific outcomes. Now, she makes the specific point that her work does not focus on spiritual paths rooted in the systems of Asian religious traditions, but she also welcomes dialogue with those interested in discussing those connections between her work and the religious traditions. Now, very prominent today is the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn. Kabat-Zinn began with Buddhism decades ago, but has established a practice, most popular, of mindfulness-based stress reduction, rooted in the science of the mind's attentiveness. He has a PhD from MIT in molecular biology. Here is Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness. Mindfulness can be thought of as moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness, cultivated by paying attention in a specific way, that is, in the present moment, and as non-reactively, as non-judgmentally, and as open-heartedly as possible, end quote. As with others, mindfulness for him is about full engagement with life and a deeper understanding of what it means to be fully human. In this quote, I start the second line at the end. If we have a desire for the world to be more peaceful, for example, can we take a good look and see if we can be at all peaceful ourselves? Can we notice how bellicose we can be at times, how belligerent, how self-centered and self-serving in the microcosm of our own life and mind? End quote. Noting the political implications of mindfulness, he points to people like Joan of Arc, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. as ones who knew the power of bearing witness to the realities of the world. Quote, simply bearing witness changes everything, and moving down, by embodying one's truth without forcing anything to be different, but without recoiling from the witnessing, even in the face of overwhelming physical force or social coercion, and perhaps one's own fears as well. There is no separation of transcendence and life here. Life is a matter of embedded transcendence. And the second example is education, and I bring this together with the Protestant principle. Tillich believed that Protestantism had the threefold responsibility to call people to experience the boundary and all of its sometimes threatening force, to experience the yes of divine grace, and to live in the new being as one experiences it in traditional and non-traditional contexts. Several years ago, I worked to translate, so to speak, the Protestant principles into principles of meaning-giving substance. What I found was this, that the principles reject idolatrous absolutism in politics, ethics, and religion, the impulse to control, and individualism, but that they affirmed personhood, the creative capacity of human beings, and deep dialogue between contrasting viewpoints. They open a wide doorway to the deliberation on the broad boundary to which our time calls us, or to that situation, as I've been trying to reformulate it here, beyond the boundary. One area that could illustrate this is pedagogical practice. Is it possible for us to learn and therefore teach students to become creative, deliberative, healing participators on the boundary? Tillich asserted that we have this task in the world, to prepare the way, that is, first of all, not to obstruct any form of grace that is united with radical prophetic criticism and concrete rational criticism, to prepare the way into which the spirit of the kairos, and thus the spirit of Protestantism, will lead us. One example of how this can take place in education is in teaching our students how to engage in respectful, truth-seeking discussion of issues of importance to life in our day. My colleague at Marshall, Susan Nygaard, and I have approached this using two different models. She describes her fishbowl model in this way, The class is divided into 2 teams. Each team gets about 16 minutes inside the bowl in an inner circle of discussion. Then the other team has 10 minutes. They're outside watching. That other team has 10 minutes to ask the inner group some questions. And after that, the teams switch places, and we do another 16 plus 10-minute set of rounds. These teams have been working together for much of the semester. All the students are using their laptops. Each team uses a Google Doc, that's a shared digital document, to prepare for discussion over weeks, collecting in it quotations, questions, their ideas, mastering the information. They also use Google Chat. That's that function where you can have a conversation while you're looking at the document, while they're in the middle of discussing and strategizing, making sure each member contributes and keeping track of their time. The group in the outer circle is also using a shared document to brainstorm questions for their upcoming question and answer session in the next moment. Each group is graded as a group according to a rubric. Now, she monitors all of this while it's happening. She even gives her own comment. She's looking at 2 sets of Google Docs and 2 computers. I mean, it's an obsessive-compulsive person's dream as far as I'm concerned. But it's intent. It's committed to helping students gain competency in mastering material and greater confidence in assembling and sharing their perspectives. That's the goal of it. Now, the approach I used in my critical thinking and current events course is a modified Harkness approach, is what it's called. And during an academic term, the class will research 4 or 5 major issues of local, regional, national, international importance. At minimum, the students will have a couple of weeks, perhaps 3 weeks, to prepare research on the issues, recording their findings on a Google document that I supply for them, each one. And sources will include those that I provide them as well as those they discover. Student-guided roundtable discussions then are at the core at the end of the research period. I work very hard to say nothing in the midst of the student discussion. They're evaluated in both the extent that they effectively bring the fruits of their research to discussion and the degree to which they're attentive to the input of their class members, both their verbal and nonverbal signals, as well as the efforts that they make to abide by respect for their classmates' dignity in the pursuit of truth. The students established the guidelines for discussion. In the most recent semester, they were these. 1, we'll start with respect in discussing issues with each other. 2, each of us will bring our individual pools of meaning to discussions. 3, our responses to one another will be constructive. And this is an interesting one. 4, we will use our knowledge of each other in a way that makes our comments productive rather than divisive. And 5, whatever the outcome of any discussion, a successful discussion will be characterized by honest effort to understand and listen to each other. The goals are for the students not only to know the issues related to the topics of discussion, but to guide the discussions and to make sound connection with one another as they engage in the discussions. Winning the debate's not the point. Respectful understanding of one another is the goal. And taken together, these 2 approaches illustrate an effort to create a beyond-the-boundary experience where sound, informed, respectful, collaborative pursuit of truth can occur. Conclusion. I'm a musician. In music, one learns early on the distinction point between notes, which are the sounds, and rests, which are the silent, soundless places. The silence and the sounds form the music. I learned in my first year of college that one could be sloppy about rests. When I had the opportunity to accompany a classmate who was performing a Poulenc sonata. After she had learned the flute part and I had learned the accompaniment fairly well, I began attending a handful of her lessons. It was not long before her instructor, Judith Bentley, identified my sloppy non-observance of the rests. It was then that I learned the centrality of the silences for the meaning of the sounds in music. And this is in addition to what you have there. Mindfulness, both in the formal practice of thought and reflection and meditation, as well as in the day-to-day experience of living lives leaning toward deep personhood and community in our interactions with one another, composes the music of the beyond-the-boundary existence. The late Irish poet and Hegel scholar John O'Donoghue argued that the contemporary situation is a dangerous one of, quote, the evacuation of interiority, end quote. The dynamic interplay of silence and sound I've suggested here involve the reconstruction of life as the dimension where creativity and healing are perpetually woven into its fabric, where human beings can cultivate internal and collaborative skills that can lead to dramatic consequences for reality. This is a beyond-the-boundary existence that one inhabits and can inhabit with mindful depth. I submit that we have reached the precipice. Our future demands that we undertake such projects to empower one another to bring the grace of infinitude more effectively into reality through living now beyond the boundary. Thank you.